Hey, how's it going? I wanted to make a video dedicated to talking about mastering. I've done a lot of videos lately on the API board, and that's been a lot of fun, but mastering has always been a big focus of mine. My first studio that I had in New York City in Manhattan in the late 1990s, I opened when I was 26 years old, and the focus of that studio became mastering, and so I did a fair amount of it back then. And you know, it's super important, obviously. It's the last touch on your music before it goes out to the public, and you know, it can make or break a production. And a lot of things have changed over the years, particularly with regards to loudness. There's been what was called the loudness war, that just saw masters getting ridiculously loud, and it's sort of topped out at this point. Some people are even starting to bring it down, like the new LUFS system, LUFS, like, has been helpful in bringing levels down. But it's, you know, there was this sort of one-upsmanship for years of producers trying to be louder than the next producer on the radio. And that's how we got there. And it was actually very destructive for sound quality. So, you know, these are just reasons why mastering is super important. And I know when I was doing it as my main focus in New York, I had what was a really revolutionary system back then. It was a turnkey dedicated DAW for mastering by a company called Sonic Solutions, which, you know, was really early in the game. They were one of the first DAWs to port to Macintosh, and by the time I got it in 1996, it had already been out for a while, and it was one of, I think, two DAWs that could do 24-bit back then. And the nice thing about it was, I mean, it was an incredible tool to use. It was difficult to learn, mainly because it had a lot of bugs that you had to learn. But the coolest part about it was, back then, all of the top mastering engineers in the world were mostly using that system, and there was an email listserv run out of a college in West Virginia, I think it was. And you literally had everybody from Ted Jensen to Bob Katz to Bob Ludwig occasionally to Denny Purcell, and just, like, you know, all the best mastering engineers in the world, just having this free-flowing back and forth. And a lot of it was just workarounds for bugs in the Sonic system, but, you know, some of it got really deep, and, you know, like discussions, very early discussions about, you know, like Bob Katz with innovative work he did managing microdynamics, as, you know, actually I think he coined that term. And you know, it was the best education you couldn't buy. Like, you had to just know about it and sign in. And so while I spent whatever it was 4 years dedicated to mastering, I also spent 4 years, you know, just a fly on the wall, reading all of this back and forth and learning and soaking up the knowledge. And that was great. And there's a lot of material out there. Bob Katz, for example, you know, has an excellent book on mastering that I'd say it's 3rd or 4th edition by now. But, you know, these are principles that don't really change with technology that much. You know, I think I'm pretty sure Bob Owinski might have a book about it. I know he does mixing, but At any rate, there's a lot of great material out there, and obviously lots of other YouTube videos. I'm going to share with you my personal experience with it as a producer who, with this history I had with mastering. So that leads to the biggest adage, the biggest saying you're going to ever hear with regard to mastering, which is don't master your own work. Okay, so obviously the reason why people say that, and it's solid reasoning, is you've been living with it in throughout the mixing process, maybe recording and mixing process, in your room with whatever anomalies your room and your monitoring setup might have. Let me see if I can actually, I'll create a wide angle it so you can see speakers as well. So basically, if you have any blind spots in your monitoring, which most do, you're not going to be the one who's going to catch them. And if you can send your work to a mastering engineer, not only do you just get a different perspective and a different set of ears on it, which, any production can benefit from. It's why writers use editors, etc. Just getting someone who's not so deeply invested in it, to give it a once-over is so helpful. But the other reason why is that mastering engineers are really focused on that one particular stage of production, and usually what the situation is they don't have to make large investments in recording and in mixing, so they can focus their investments in the things that are most important in mastering, namely having a neutral monitoring environment. So as neutral as possible, speakers and room. And what anybody will tell you who's been doing this for a while is that speakers and room together equal your monitoring. Monitoring is not just speakers. It's a unified system. You can't separate them. And so mastering engineers typically go more than an extra mile to get as full range and as neutral a monitoring setup as possible, so that what they're listening to and the decisions that they make will translate to any consumer system that's out there. So that's the big advantage to having somebody else master your music. Now, for me, I actually have finally come to, after years and years of struggling with it, I've come to the decision that in the end, I'm best suited to master my own material. That may or may not be true, but that's the conclusion I've come to after working with a lot of really great mastering engineers. I have a little anecdote that sort of explains it, which is I once had a single that I brought to a really great mastering engineer and a friend of mine, a really nice guy, and we sat down and before we mastered my mix, my song, on his system in his room, we just put up song after song after song of finished, professional material, just our favorite stuff sonically. And, and it ranged from 80s, 90s, 2000s, whatever. The fascinating thing that we saw was that while there are certain guideline barriers to, where you can be wrong, there wasn't really a right. Like there wasn't a middle of the bullseye. There was just the edge of the board, if you get my drift. And because there was so much latitude for artistic expression, this Steve Lillywhite's stuff sounds completely different from Hugh Padgham's, sounds completely different from, you name it, take your pick. Butch Vig, or whoever. And, you know, and they should sound different. There's a different, you know, it's different artistic expression. So, but the interesting sort of takeaway from that is that, again, as long as you're still on the board at all, that a lot of mastering comes down to the personal taste of the mastering engineer, in very much the same way that mix engineers, you know, I don't think a good mix engineer can really ever remove their taste from the work that they do. That's just the way it goes. That's why you hire a human being to do it, in spite of all the efforts of certain software companies to automate everything. You want their taste, you want their, you know, their experience and their perspective, and that's no different when it comes to mastering, which might be a shock to some people. It's presented as either this black art or this absolute science. And the truth is, it's you know, right in the middle of those two things. And so for my part, I just found that every mastering engineer I worked with did great work, and very often there would be, you know, some element of their work that was, you know, better than I could do. You know, usually it was low end or something, but you know, that usually was the case. But when it was finished, every single time I found myself tweaking, and you know, and I would usually, you know, I would do 2 rounds, maybe even 3 with them, you know, just listening, giving them some notes, and you know, I mean, I've never had the experience of like a huge major label budget, you know, like a $10,000 or $20,000 mastering budget. So maybe that's how that works. Like, you go live with Bob Ludwig for 2 weeks and you get to do all that. But you know, your more typical scenario, where, you know, a mastering engineer is taking a few hours to do a project for you. You know, that's the way that's always gone for me. And that's included me attending the session and then not attending the session. You know, after attending a few sessions, I came to the conclusion that it actually went better when I don't attend, and, you know, let them have their, you know, their breathing room and their leeway to experiment a little bit without me, you know, literally over their shoulder. So, you know, but even with that, either way, attended or not attended, I kept on having to make tweaks. So as time went by and, you know, my monitoring got better and my gear got better, I started finding that, like, hey, I think I can actually achieve some of these things that these guys were doing that I thought I couldn't. And it just got to a point where I found that, you know, I could get it to where I wanted it to be, in consumer systems. And so that's my story. That's not going to be everybody's. You know, part of that also comes from the time I spent mastering, left an impression on me where, you know, I take acoustics and speakers very, very seriously. And I mean, you know, we all do to some extent, but it's, you know, like these right here are PMC 226s. These are not cheap. These were recommended to me actually by the Hasselwig brothers, who make amazing boutique tube equipment, and it was a great suggestion. At the time that I got these, I was already using Quested V2108s, and I still have those speakers. They're great, but you know, that's an example where so my room was not $100,000 or more, you know, Walter Sturrock or Hidley designed control room. It was the best that I could do acoustically, and I found that the Questeds really are big, and they were like, I think they really are more like midfield speakers than near field, and they interacted with the room a lot. And if the room was perfect, that wouldn't matter so much. But in my room, it was actually a bit of a problem. And I was having some translation issues with it, even though they're fantastic speakers. But that's how important the interaction of the room and the speakers is. And this is not really rare knowledge. A lot of people are familiar with this, but the PMCs were fantastic because they were a lot smaller. I mean, these are true like bookshelf near field speakers, but they all at once, I mean, it's like magic. All at once, they're much more focused, and they don't interact with the room anywhere near as much as the Questas did, at least. But at the same time, what's really interesting about them is that the mix is extremely well dispersed and balanced. I mean, more than any other speaker I've worked with, it sounds the same at all corners of the room and behind me, and it's really amazing how they pull that off. They have a proprietary bass system in all their speakers, and it's really it's a port. It's not a speaker, and it just the sound winds around inside the speaker, and the result is a tiny little speaker like this can get down to 40 hertz or 45 hertz or something, and get pretty low. I still use a subwoofer with bass management with them, but they're just really amazing. So I'm spending a lot of time talking about the speakers, but this is about mastering. In mastering, there's nothing more important really than your speakers, because you can't make these decisions without accurate monitoring. And it's worth saying that in mastering, every decision you make, every tweak you make is so tectonic. You just nudge something a tiny little bit and it makes this huge change. Typically, equalization changes in mastering all tend to take place within 1 dB. And I'm not kidding. You need to be able to measure in tenths of a dB, at least, as much as you can with analog too. There are some equalizers, every equalizer is a little bit different, but that's pretty typical for mastering, to be doing these very, very small increments. And so if it makes that big of a difference, you have to be able to hear a tenth of a dB. You need great speakers and a great room. So, all right. So that's why you should send it out for mastering, and that's why I don't. And you make your own decision about how it works for you. Just for context, when I was in New York, I think I mastered upwards of about 200 albums. So that was the experience I came into with mastering my own stuff. So, it's just worth noting that, it's a very, very different perspective working on a done mix than it is working with tracks. And that sounds obvious, but you have to spend some time doing it to really appreciate it. And there's all kinds of proprietary techniques. When you're working with a stereo mix in particular, I won't even get into surround, but if you're working with a stereo mix and you don't have access to the original mix, or you can't send it back to somebody and say, hey, your vocal's too loud, remix it or something, which does happen. If something's too out of line, I will send it back to somebody and have them redo it, or God forbid it's my mix, so I'll just run it again. But but assuming that's not available, and you just have to work with whatever they gave you, well, there's a lot of different hoops you can jump through to affect those kinds of things. you know, it deserves a nod that there's Isotope Ozone software has this algorithm that claims to separate the instruments. Actually, Bobcats did a video about it, I think. Either that or he discussed it. I can't remember which, but I have it. It's just on its face, it just seemed too hokey to me. I've never really worked with it much. I think that's part of the reason why is that I've spent years, you know, just sort of doing it the traditional way, and you know, you get kind of stuck in your ways. But the traditional way is really taking what I would call a very three-dimensional perspective on a stereo mix. And typically when mix engineers talk about three-dimensional, they're talking about, you know, the front to back dimension using reverbs and things like that. What I would be talking about is you've got left, right, and then, you know, you've also got mid-side available, and there's a ton of mid-side processors these days. You know, mastering engineers used to have to sort of jerry-rig that. But these days there's just tons and tons of dedicated MS processors. And so the way that can be useful in mastering is, you know, take a typical scenario, the vocal's too loud or not loud enough. You can really hone in, you know, like find sort of the meat of the voice. You know, is it 1.5K, is it 2K, whatever it happens to be, and boost or cut just in the middle where the voice is, just in that frequency range, and really get it pretty isolated just that way. And that, you know, typically in most pop mixes, you know, there's certain things that are usually straight up center: kick, snare, bass, vocals, you know, and then there's things that are typically on the sides. So like cymbals, guitars, keyboards, effects, and reverbs usually are on the sides. So the ability to isolate, you know, mid or side and only process one or the other is amazing. And then take that a step further with things, you know, like multi-band compressors, you know, like, so, you know, let's say, you know, your kick isn't very tight or punchy. You know, you can do mid only and then do a multi-band compressor where you're only compressing, you know, whatever, below 120 hertz or something. And again, you're getting really isolated, really specific processing. You have to be careful, of course. Too much MS, you know, work can affect phase. You have to just be careful and listen for that. But it's an amazing tool, and you know, so to that end, I want to come back to that when I want to talk about Wavelab in a little bit. But Wavelab has some amazing facilities for doing MS processing. But let me come back to that. So one thing, well, I guess let's talk about differences between analog and digital processing. I think like a lot of people, I didn't, you know, when I started doing this, I couldn't afford great analog processing. It's very expensive. So a lot of the processing that I started off with was in the box and using plugins, and that's fine. Particularly now, there's really amazing plugins out there. Just personal preferences. You know, I'm not actually a huge fan of Ozone. You know, I bought the suite, and then because I owned it, I just keep updating it because it's not expensive to update. But you know, it's just one of those things where, like, it's good. It's not a bad suite, but I just find that I have other third-party versions of just about everything they do that I tend to prefer. Now, with they just released version 10, and iZotope's just been going crazy with AI and just trying to make decisions for you, and that rubs me the wrong way. It doesn't mean it can't be good, but I forgot his name, but the Dutch guy with White Sea Studios, I just saw a YouTube video he did about some of the automated processes in Ozone 10, and it was, it's funny. He's a funny guy, but I don't like having. I don't like an AI making decisions for me. And again, even long before they introduced the AI, the processors just didn't, beat what I already had. So that's my personal opinion. The convenient thing about it is if you don't have gobs of money, you do get just about everything in one package. So if you're just starting off with mastering, or it can be really good for that, actually. All right, so that's Ozone. So again, talking about the differences between digital processing and analog processing, I guess what you really want to address is there's a couple of specific issues, actually. I mean, obviously with analog gear, and I've got, some, each box has its own signature and its own sound, and you can fall in love with lots of different pieces. Like, I don't happen to have any Manley gear, but it's awfully good, and certainly, lots of people embrace that. You find things that you like. I have this, a Chandler curve bender EQ. This is their recreation of the equalizer out of an Abbey Road desk, and it uses germanium circuits, and it's just got a sound. And from my part, like, I get all my transparent processing in the computer. That's not why I buy analog gear. I buy analog gear specifically for the sound, and if I don't want the sound, I just don't use it. I guess real quick, I can whip through some of my favorites in terms of plugins. And there's nothing unusual. Lots of guys will tell you the same thing. Love FabFilter's EQ, of course. The dynamic EQ is fantastic. The facility's there. Actually, an EQ that I really love, and I've loved for a long time, is Plugin Alliance's BX Digital, which they're up to version 3 now, which has like two very rudimentary dynamic EQ bands, but it's basically it's a standard parametric EQ, 4 or 5 band parametric EQ. But the unique thing about it was it's really built from the ground up for MS, and they did this before the MS craze. And something about it just being laid out that way is, I should pull it up for you, but go take a look, go check it out. It's just an extremely musical EQ, particularly for a plugin. Dirk did a wonderful job on that. I think he designed the analog piece that it was based on as well. I think it was his first product, actually. But so those two EQs are probably my favorites. Another one I like a lot is the Amec 200 in the Plugin Alliance. That just has sort of like a Neve style smack to it. That's nice. By far and away right now, my favorite brick wall limiter is, again, Plugin Alliance BX True Peak. That I can pull up. It's this. And very simply, it can get louder in a more transparent way than any other one that I've tried. I have the FabFilter L2. That's great. It's a great product. you know, so I don't know, maybe it's just like this was newer and you like what's new. I don't know, but I tend to like this one better though. And frankly, like I just said how much I don't like Ozone. The piece I like the most in Ozone is the final piece, is the maximizer brick wall limiter. You know, that's probably, I think that's the highest quality thing in there. But again, this is the one I really like. So, so that's EQs, and you know, for compressors, again, I mentioned the multi-band compressor. That the one I like is from FabFilter, but there's lots of different ones out there. And then who knows? There's so many different things you can end up using. Maximizers can be really useful in mastering. So that's a bottom-up compressor. An example of that would be Waves Max Volume, and UAD also has a precision maximizer. It does pretty much the same thing. One of my favorite techniques in mastering is to take a maximizer like that and put it on just the sides. So in an MS situation, and use it very subtly, but it breathes the sort of atmosphere and life into the music without it being overstated. It's funny, I think I'm blanking on his name, but there's a British guy that makes mastering videos, and he had a video about that, but it was something where like he was introducing it like it was a big secret, but it was something I'd been doing for a while, and it's just a great use of it. It's both subtle, but it makes a huge difference. And you know, and as opposed to just boosting the sides in a very blunt way, doing it with a maximizer it's sort of warmer, more subtle, and yeah, my advice is try it. I think you'll really love it. But that's, you know, that's also an interesting thing in general in mastering, is just, you know, I think in one of these songs that I have up here right now, there's an interesting example. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, okay. So here I have the FabFilter multi-band, and you'll see there's a little S and a little M. So I've got two instances of the same plugin, but one on the sides and one in the middle, and they can do very different things. Here, we're not playing this right now, but yeah, so that's the one I have on the sides, and then I've got one in the middle. And so I'm treating, you know, this is like a little scoop on the low mids, and you know, it's just really interesting to be able to address music in that way, and it really opens things up, and you can get results. You know, like there's no way to do that in mixing, really. You know, it's that kind of thing has to be done sort of at the mastering stage. And then is this the 200? Oh, this is the 250. This is their newer EQ that Plugin Alliance put out, AMEC 250. Yeah, I have the whole Plugin Alliance Mega Bundle. I highly recommend it. I mean, it's if you can afford it. They have lots of sub bundles too. You know, maybe just the mix bundle or something, or the mix and master bundle. But they've got such great products, and it's the one situation I know of in the industry where a subscription is not a bad deal; it's actually a good deal. So that's interesting. Just the bang for the buck is incredible. Like how many tools you get and what high quality they are. Yeah, I highly recommend it. Anyway, so again, back to analog versus digital. So to my mind, again, I said this earlier, or I kind of brushed over it. I tend to want to do more of my precision work in the box. Certainly corrective EQ. You know, I want to do that in the box with FabFilter or the BX. And then when I want color, well, okay, so let's think for a second. What does color actually mean? Sorry, I have a cold. For the most part, you're talking about adding harmonic distortion. That's what color usually means. And people, you know, are using saturators to do that. And there are lots of, you know, plugins that will do that. But that's a case where the sort of a non-linearity to it that, you know, I feel like analog gear just does better. And then God forbid you actually have something with, you know, tubes and transformers, you know, physical tubes and transformers and germanium circuits and you know, more tubes and transformers. And, you know, to me, there's not really a substitute for that. You know, the real stuff just sounds better. Now, there's a special case when it comes to compressors. You know, you may have noticed that, you know, compressors have been, you know, if you've been doing this for the last 10 or 15 years, you would notice that it's been harder for plugin publishers to make convincing compressors. It was one of the things that made universal audio plugins stand out so much, you know, early on, that they did such a good job of that. And I think part of the reason why was that they were manufacturing some of the best analog compressors, and they were really meticulous about modeling every part of the circuit. But even with them, you know, to my ear, most plug-in compressors just sound kind of small compared to their analog counterparts. And there's actually an incredible video by FabFilter on oversampling. And one of the things they talk about is that specifically with compressors, there's that you can get a ringing that will go up octaves in harmonics. And if you're using any kind of a reasonable sample rate, if you're using anything lower than, you know, 380 kilohertz as a sample rate, you can very often get you know, a ringing back down the spectrum and aliasing from compressors, and that's what, you know, oversampling is used to treat. This is a very simple, you know, sort of light breeze through this. Watch the video; they explain it much better than I could. But so oversampling in compressors is used to make up for the you know, for the frequency response you don't have if you're working in 44, 48, even 88, 96K. And as a result, you know, you see this on a lot of software compressors that, you know, it'll include oversampling as a choice and let the user dial it in. And it's just worth noting that it's a different ball game with compressors than it is with equalizers. You know, most publishers will have a reason for putting in oversampling, and so it's usually good to use it if you have the DSP headroom to do it. But you know, but with compressors in particular, you're really doing yourself a disservice if you don't. Now, that being said, you can get around that issue entirely if you just use analog compressors. That's just not an issue. So that's another really good argument for going analog, not to mention the fact that you can do things like get them with tubes and transformers. And so, you know, to my mind, there's uses for both. There's things that either one is best at doing. And assuming you have high quality converters and that the master itself is in pretty good shape, you know, your music can usually withstand one trip through analog processing. I use Wavelab by Steinberg as a dedicated mastering DAW. It's a little bit of money, and I think a lot of people will be like, well, can't you just master in Pro Tools or in any DAW? And the answer is yes, of course you can. But there's some mastering specific features in Wavelab that for me make it worth it. When CDs were more popular, Wavelab had the full suite of abilities to put in CD marks and CD text and ISRC codes, and it could create, CD masters as well as DDP masters to send to CD pressing plants. So it was necessary for that. Honestly, you don't get very much of that anymore. I still have a few artists who want CDs, but and they are even still manufacturing CDs, but for the most part it's just send me waves, and I still find Wavelab to be helpful and useful in mastering even without needing the CD features. So Wavelab is on version 11 right now. I think it was in version 11, or it might have been in 10, that they just introduced the ability to use external equipment, external gear as a plugin in your chain of plugins and be able to put it anywhere you want. So that's nice, and it's funny because it's one of those things where before we had it, I think I grumbled a lot about, I wish they would add the ability to do this. And then when they did, I realized that, because before they did it, my workflow was I would just run the track through all the analog gear and then into Wavelab and then do everything else I needed to do in the box. Well, now that I have the ability to put it anywhere in the chain, I'm still doing it the way I was doing it before. And the reason being that if I use analog gear in Wavelab, then every export that I do has to be real time, and if I'm running a few drafts or copies, that gets to be a drag. So I just as soon keep doing it the way I was doing it. And the other thing about it too is I like the sound of the analog gear best, and so my attitude is let me run the masters through that and get it as close as I can with all that gear, and then that minimizes how much I'm doing with the digital gear. The only exception to that being that if there's things that I want to correct before I go through the analog gear, and that so that's the only place there can be an exception. But yeah, I'm pretty much doing analog stage and then digital. So and when I'm doing the mixing, even more so, because I'm usually doing most of the analog stuff, on my master insert on the API. So it's just done, and and then I can not worry about it at all and go right to Wavelab. So let's take a little closer look at Wavelab just for a second. There are a lot of videos on Wavelab. I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but it's just a really interesting system. It's one of Steinberg's oldest products, and it was designed by one guy. And what they did was they bought it and kept him. And he still writes the program, does the updates, administers the forum, for it. And it's evolved a lot over the years. It wasn't until version 8, I want to say, that they made it for Macintosh. But there's good and bad about it being so much this one guy's baby. I use a Steinberg DAW for my general production. I use Nuendo, which is the same as Cubase with some extra post-production features. And there's things that I wish they would consistify between Wavelab and Nuendo. But the problem is there's things that are better in both. So what I would love is if they would take the best of both, you know, and then really consistify the two programs, but they're not. So when a certain point in time, they brought in some of the Cubase Nuendo keystrokes, like the zoom is the same strokes, but there's a lot that's not the same, and the overall architecture is a little weird, and it takes getting used to when you first get it. And I'll try to whip through that as quickly as I can. So what would normally be like the piano roll editor or whatever, the project window in most DAWs, is called the audio montage in Wavelab, and the name is, you know, rose by any other name. It's the project window, and you know, you can put as many tracks as you want. If you like having every song on an album, if you're mastering an album on its own track, you can do that. But you can also do things like, what I find myself doing is I'll separate an album by dynamics. So I'll have loud songs, you know, on one track and quiet songs on another one, because I generally will want like different brick wall limiter settings for those two things. So an interesting thing about Wavelab is up here. This on this side is this master section, and it's also, so that's like your final 2-mix output section. And then there's also what's called the inspector, which is just your plugins that are being applied to here. And there's actually 4 levels now. There used to be 3. There's the clip level, which is object oriented. So if you've ever worked with Samplitude or Sequoia, they do this too. It's a lot like offline processing on any other DAW, but it's right here. It's, you know, it's not offline. It's right here. So anything you put on here will follow the clip if you move it. And there's, actually, this is pretty new. I haven't even messed with it yet. They finally added volume and fades automation, I guess dynamic automation. And then there's also a pan and a fader output just for the object itself. Then the next level would be the track. And so that's what I was saying about putting like all my loud songs on one track and all my soft ones on another one. So I can have 2 different instances of the brick wall limiter, and, you know, appropriate for loud or soft or whatever. It's one way to break it up. You can do it any way you want. Again, you could have every song on its own track, or, you know, however you want to handle it. And then there's actually an output fader or section. There's like a master bus section just for the audio montage. And this is a little confusing. At least when I first got it, I found it a little confusing, because there's that, and then there's this master section where you can also put plugins, and it feels redundant and a little weird. I think by default the master section does not save with the audio montage, which can screw you up if you're not careful. I'm almost positive there's a preference that you can make it save with it, but I don't know, it just gets to be too much. You can also save presets for it as well. What I have decided is the easiest thing to do is I put the really, really general stuff on here. So basically I have an analysis plugin. This is called Supervision. Steinberg makes this. It's in Cubase as well and Nuendo. And it's pretty awesome. You can put as many different windows as you want and put all different kinds of analyzers. So like this is doing waveforms right now. I can switch that to, is there a spectral thing? Yeah. Spectrum curve or spectrum intensity. That's a fun one. So that sucker. And then beyond this plugin, Wavelab just has a ton of analysis just built in. There's loudness, there's phase scope, you know, and then there's levels with the RMS and your peak and your, you know. So one of the things that's great about Wavelab is this really huge wealth of analysis. Like you're not gonna miss things on there. So those are the different ways you can apply plugins. What I will do is there's a dedicated section now for resampling. So like if I'm mixing, I'm usually mixing 96K files, and then I'm outputting CD quality, you know, so 44K 16-bit. So I'm resampling down to 44 here, and then they have a dedicated section post fader for dither, which is convenient. And so I'm sample rate converting to 44 and dithering down to 16 here, and outputting CD resolution. You know, and I can change that if I want to do it differently. So this just stays this way no matter which audio montage I'm pulling up. And then if I want to do any 2-mix work or, you know, master bus work, I'll just do it on the inspector thing here. And that does save with everything here. It does save with the audio montage. So you know, there's so much to this. There's breakpoint volume editing. You can also, because there's object-oriented plugins, you can split your waveforms and put different plugins on the different objects that you've created. So you could cut up, you know, your choruses and put different processing on that. And there's automated processes for generating your start marks and end marks for CDs. And then, so there's a tab here for CD, and then there's a place to enter CD text. And like I said, you can customize your gaps, pre and post gaps. And you know, it's incredibly deep and incredibly flexible. I haven't even scratched the surface for what's possible editing wise. There's a ton. These volume envelopes, you know, there's a whole tab for envelopes, and you can put them before or after the plugins. There's just a tremendous amount of flexibility. So you know, I actually alluded to this. I showed you this earlier, but I didn't actually show you how I did it. So like one of the things Wavelab has that's so cool is that M and that S. So that's just right here. And you can, on any plugin, you can tell it exactly where you want it to apply. That's amazing. You know, it's just fantastic. You can take an 1176 compressor and only do it on the sides and only do it on the mids. I mean, it's just, you know, there are third-party plugins and chainer plugins that will let you do that, but it's just built into the DAW. The only other thing I would say about Wavelab is, it's funny, they spend a lot of time on their videos on their own proprietary plugins. Again, it's kind of like Ozone in that, like, I don't use them all that much because I just love a lot of the third-party stuff that I have. But I don't know, like, I should put more energy into checking out what they've done. They made a whole suite of mastering stuff that is probably really great. I mean, Steinberg's plugins are good. They're not you know, they're not crap. But it's amazing how they look like a pretty close ripoff, at least in the design of Ozone. And the fact that I don't love Ozone, I think, gave me a bias against the Steinberg stuff, even though I hadn't really used it. And I need to get over that, because there are some cool features built in to the Steinberg plugins because they're integrating with the Steinberg DAW. that's worth knowing too. It's like if you drop the $500 on Wavelab, you do get a really nice suite of plugins. You know, like I am using, there's a restoration rig, and you know, there's a declicker, a denoiser, a debuzzer. You know, there's a lot of fun to play with, and so where that's the restoration rig, there's also a mastering rig, which, you know, has all these components like Ozone does. But like, so my point being, if you drop the 500 and you buy Wavelab, you will get a pretty comprehensive suite of tools built in, but you'll also get to use, you know, all your third-party plugins too. You know, Steinberg actually authored and continues authoring the VST spec. It's their baby, so they play well with VST plugins. You know, again, I've just barely scratched the surface with what Wavelab can do. There's one thing that's pretty cool. So when you click on an object, you actually get an entirely different menu depending on whether you click on the top or the bottom. And so on the bottom, you can, one of the most useful features I find is there's replace audio file. And it's awesome because, like, if you've done, you know, a volume curve and you've done fades on the beginning and the end, and you have your markers all set up, and then you decide you want to make a change to the mix, or the client sends you a change to the mix, you can just do that replace audio file, and it will retain all of your edits and your plugins and everything you've done to it, and it'll just swap in the new file. I can't tell you how many times that's been useful. I mean, it's just like every time, particularly when I'm doing the mix, because if there are any level changes and I'm the one doing the mix, I'm not going to jump through hoops in mastering. I'm going to just go fix it in the mix and then swap in the new file. So I find that particularly really cool. All right. Just sort of going back in my mind, wrapping up. I guess the one thing I never actually say is it's not a hard and fast rule. I'll do whatever a track needs, but just to share my typical mastering chain for analog gear, at least, particularly since getting the API, is I'll play the wave file, the pre-master wave file, and it's funny, like I can actually just play it right out of the Finder because it'll still go through you know, my converter. The only problem with that is then I don't have good digital metering. So sometimes, like, I mean, I can open, you know, my production DAW, I can open Nuendo and play it out of that. It doesn't matter either way. So it'll play out of the converter, and I'll, you know, using the patch bay, I'll bring it into the API. Into the API, and I'll hit the compressor that's built into this console, which is just a pair of API 527s, but they link, which is nice. And they have, you know, the thrust feature. It's very similar to a 2500 API. So I'll hit that, and then what I'll normally do is I'll have all the other gear in the master insert of the master channel, so that so then when it comes back from all that gear and then it goes through the main output fader, it's hitting the output transformers in the board and going right back into the converter. By the way, that's my converter, the links. And then I can record that right into Wavelab. Wavelab will let you record directly into it. So that's really convenient because then the file's right there, and, you know, no import necessary. So again, like, I'll typically hit that compressor, do the insert, and then lately my go-to chain, although it's always flexible, is I'll go from that to this, which is Fern VT7. Sorry about the SSL in the way there and the shadows. But Fern VT7, it's a stereo tube compressor. It's transformer balanced. It's phenomenal. If you haven't heard of it, I mean, you see these in just about every studio shot. And then I'll go from that to the curve bender equalizer. Again, amazing. I love this piece. It's just like, it can get a low end and a high end that, well, everything it does just sounds fantastic. Describing it is like describe the color orange. You just gotta use it and try it. But it's I love it. And then what I'll sometimes do is go from that to this pair of Audioscape Pultec clones, and they're fantastic as well. I love them. And I find between these and the curve bender, I can really get a lot of what I need EQ wise. I mean, neither one of them is particularly surgical, but between the two of them, you know, by the time it's gone through the API compressor, the Fern, that, and the Pultecs, man, like if it doesn't sound good, then I'm probably going to send it back and tell them to fix the mix. But that's my typical analog chain. And then get it into Wavelab. Yeah, I can be very sparing about what I do from that point on. As I mentioned earlier, I usually will try to do, you know, any surgical issues, any fixing issues before I even send it through all this. So what's left to do in Wavelab is mostly brick wall, you know, the brick wall limiter and maybe some multi-band compression, but you know, that's usually about it. There's not usually a lot of EQing at that point. So, all right, thanks everybody. I hope this was interesting and maybe even helpful to some people. I do mastering for hire. Feel free to reach out to me for that. And please, you know, if this was in any way positive for you, please like it, share it, you know, and leave me comments, questions. I'd love to talk to you guys about it more. And, you know, I'd love to delve into a little more detail at some point about all of the issues that I raised. I mean, this was really, even though this is a long video, I kind of glossed over a lot of really heavy stuff. But all right, thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.